place.
Thank you. Would you mind, sir?
Hey, folks, you want to start? All right.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dad. So let's talk about quick first who is Fast Robot. First off, this is 3 techniques for promoting CI Chef Repo objects through CI techniques. So we're a small Unix consultancy. We've been doing this since 2009. System administrators long enough that we generally call this the system administration game rather than anything fancier. Technically, though, what we almost always do is integrate systems together. You never get the greenfield opportunity where you spec everything out at once. More often than not, you tiptoe through the brownfield of a bunch of legacy systems and processes. As the CI that you use to promote anything in your company is an extension of your company's policies, products, and pain points, we end up adapting this process to the client. So let's think about you guys, y'all. I think you value infrastructure as code. You think that everything that is electronic about your company and moves should be covered as code and should be in source control. You realize that if humans do the promotion and testing of things, humans mess up. So having processes do this for you is absolutely advantageous. You probably already have some familiarity with CI/CD. This would be a terrible place to start because I don't think I'll give you the right treatment of it. But I do at least want you to be familiar. Maybe you're just doing some apps. Maybe you know how to promote cookbooks that way already. Specifically, I hope you have a cookbook CI process. It lends itself pretty well to that, right? Cookbooks are versioned. They have an artifact. They produce an artifact, the tarball with the version number. So you looked around for how you can do Chef Repo promotions. There's not a lot of stuff on the internet. There's not a lot of prior examples of this. Plenty of good examples for cookbooks. So we're going to try and cover that gap. What do I want you to have at the end of this? I want you to talk about all the things you could manage via a Git-based Chef Repo. And I'm going to define this so it's not so confusing. But more importantly, I want to know what you should manage via the API and via Git processes in Chef Repo. And of course, the wisdom to know the difference between the two. As we approached each of these clients and worked with them, we had a bunch of trade-offs we considered. We did a lot of false starts, and I wanted to kind of walk you through our thought process and what we ended up with and why. These are not all happy success stories. Some of them are, of course, terrible, tragic stories. But at the end, I'll give you some pointers and code examples for all the techniques we're talking about so you have something to start on should you try and do this yourself. So what if you just want to test and promote cookbooks only and you want to consider that half of the chef policy question? Great idea, wrong talk. There are lots of published solutions around this already. There's actually a parallel talk happening in the other room, so I can wait if you all want to leave. Chef Automate has a perfectly good solution around PR branches in GitHub, merge that down to a cookbook, run it through a bunch of tests and batteries, and promote it up to Artifactory or Supermarket. The Chef themselves just released a new Jenkins plugin that does exactly that. It has a really nice UI, integrates well with Jenkins and Blue Ocean. It looks cool, and it's written in very traditional Maven-style plugin. The Hedge Ops, Michael Hedgepeth, I think, has an excellent treatment of cookbook promotion with Jenkins file. You can never go wrong listening to Noah. He has what I consider to be the best treatment of running Jenkins servers in Docker as opposed to trying to manage it with a Chef cookbook. Should you want to manage a Chef server, a Jenkins server with a Chef cookbook though, Stephen King has this Typo 3, all of his infrastructure is up. It's excellent, phenomenal, great starting point. So, taking a step back, what is in the Chef repo? The succinct version we use is all the unversioned objects in Chef. Cookbooks absolutely have a version. Roles, environments, data bags, they don't. The version that's living in the server is the version that all your clients are going to pull down. So everything in the Chef repo is what we call the unversioned object collection. Again, it was roles, environments, data bags. Now, if you want to know what you can manage via the Chef repo, you can read the Chef API documentation. You can also make a clean directory, copy in your .chef directory, and just do a knife download / and it will give you a ton of things. The roles, environments, and data bags I consider to be the minimum point of entry for what I'd like to manage via Git. But you could, of course, manage cookbooks that way. I will never recommend a mono repo for development. Mono repo where all of your Chef policy is in a Chef repo, and you have a cookbook directory with all your cookbooks in it. That is a terrible idea. If anyone tells you I said that, they are lying. But at the root of every Chef repo, I usually have a Burks file, which is a pointer to all of the cookbooks that that project needs to run with. And as part of these Jenkins pipelines we're going to be talking about, it kicks off a Burks install, Burks upload using this. You could use it in lieu of a supermarket. You could also just have it pointing to entries in your private supermarket or public supermarket. Not as common, but something you could manage via Chef repo and this Git process is node objects. If you run a knife node show -fj, it will dump out that node as a giant JSON object. If you didn't pass it the long option, it'll give you kind of a shortened version without all the oh-hi. It has the environment, the node name, certain attributes like normal attributes, you want to put them in there. It's a thing you can do. You can absolutely capture those objects in Git, and I'll get to that later. You can also do policy files. That's a very common technique. I will tell you that when we did a lot of this work, policy files were not an option. When policy files came around, they had limitations around security teams wanted to do a cross-cutting change across every single machine in the fleet. You would have to regenerate every single policy file. That is no longer true. There's include policy statements that allow you to bring in certain environments or merge two different sets of policy files together. I do worry a little that policy files has gotten rid of the Chef attribute inheritance system and then recreated the Chef attribute inheritance system, but I have it on good authority that they're stopping it too. Also, if you do the knife download / or look at the API documentation, you'll find out that there are ACLs, groups, and users that are objects you could maintain and manage via the API. There's a couple other ones in there, an org list, all the client certificates. Don't manage those. I am not smart enough to do that. You are probably smarter than I am, but that's not the sort of thing I want to manage as part of my policy. Messing with knife ACL commands or trying to change the groups via this might end up super poorly. I don't think you need to do that as part of your day-to-day work. Your mileage may vary. What's my policy on mono repos?
Use them all the time.
Damn it. No, don't do it. Seriously, don't do it. I just saw my note there, wanted to bring that up again. So let's talk about what pipelines are to me. It's anything that's going to act on using source control as a source, let's say, any sort of commit or pull request, and after some validation and testing, it's going to take some actions and promote that to the next higher level of being. That Hedge Ops blog had a very succinct and nice definition that kind of resonated with me because it mirrors the Unix philosophy of one tool that takes an input, has an output, does something well. Don't build a giant thing that does everything kind of. I'm almost always going to talk about Jenkins in this. Nothing precludes you from using another system that knows how to treat branches differently, run different stages of things through different tests, but all my examples are Jenkins files because it's popular. Because Jenkins 2.0 introduced the pipeline plugin, which has a Jenkins file that you can put in every repo. I like the idea of managing the code itself with the automation policy that Jenkins is going to use to promote that. One of these examples had the old style Jenkins where you had a job you had to configure on the Jenkins server, decoupled that from the code itself. That's not as cool. Additionally, pipeline let you dry up your code by taking these 50-line Jenkins files and turning them into a Groovy standard library, a pipeline standard lib, and shoving that elsewhere in Jenkins. So each Jenkins files you would have for a cookbook or a chef repo would be extremely short, 1 or 2 lines, just saying, do the standard pipeline operation, here are my specific credentials. But the only other thing to think about on pipelines is that every single policy change has to flow through source control. You have to have, Git is all of my examples, there's no reason it could be something else, but that's how your code gets into the chef server. Furthering that, this is the same advice I give my children, just put down the knife. Don't use knife. Don't use it for anything. No, not entirely true. A bunch of random administrators running around pushing code up into a chef server for nodes to download runs about as well as you would expect a bunch of people running around with knives. They get stabbed, they get hurt, people are upset. It's animated. I really mastered this presentation software. So let's talk about why pushing up the policy by hand is bad. There's no easy audit trail. Early versions of the chef server used to accidentally log instead of the user that made the change, it was the object ID that made the change. They fixed that. Now you can tell that a user made a post command to upload an environment, but you don't know necessarily which environment or what was in that environment. So there's no real clean path for reproducing that. If a bunch of us have run different knife commands and uploaded policy in different orders at different times, you have to coordinate with these people to figure out what happened. You have to look at Slack, chat logs, email, that sort of thing. These are all reasons not to push knife commands by hand. It's also really hard to replay that set of changes outside of using the chef server that you pushed your changes to. Later I'm going to get into talking about using AWS to build AMIs and to use Chef Zero without a chef server using the same technique. You can't do that if your only way of pushing policy is to run knife node from file or knife data bag from file, that sort of thing. So the easiest way to make sure that nobody uses the chef server via knife commands is to lock everybody out. This is, of course, overly simplistic. One of the things we like to do is make sure that only the Jenkins user can upload policy to the chef server. That is the only way it gets in. That is the only admin certified user certificate that can push changes to a chef server. However, you want to have the ability to look at the list of cookbooks on the server to run searches against it. So when I have a chef repo that controls a chef server, I generally have a .chef directory and a knife that has a copy of a read-only certificate in there. Your security policies may not allow you to have any credentials, even read-only credentials checked into Git. I personally think that if you have access to the source, that's all the stuff that gets pushed up to the chef server, you should have access to look to see the attributes and such on the chef server. Your mileage may vary, but I do like having a read-only certificate that everyone can use to query the chef server, if not push policy. But again, the Jenkins CI user is the only thing that can push policy into your chef server in my world. So let's talk about the first example company. Tiny Corp is not actually its name. That is unfortunate. It would have been a great name. But these are highly anonymized case studies. They were real companies. I blended a couple details to make it less obvious. But I didn't want to use any names, so I can get all specific about them. Super small startup company. There are maybe less than 50 people. I only tell you the number of people so you get a feel for kind of the bureaucratic and organizational overhead that they might have around change control or the number of people they have to communicate with. They have something on the order of 5 people who are actively touching Chef and trying to instantiate policy on nodes via writing cookbooks, changing roles, run lists, etc. They had a software as a service product. It took off, started going well with that. key, though, is that all the people who were using Chef were good with AWS. They were experts. They were experienced Unix users. They were rote operators, which I'll get to later. So let's talk about what the simplest version of a Chef pipeline is. You have a Jenkins file. The Jenkins file does some validation, and it's now time to push the checkout of that Chef repo up. Knife upload slash. That's it. You're done. That, of course, is a gross oversimplification. Knife upload comes in the Chef DK. Run knife upload -- help. Look carefully at all the flags. What we're doing is we're mapping a single Chef repo to a single Chef org. In this case, we divide it up into prod and non-prod. So we had a prod Chef repo and a non-prod Chef repo. We had a prod Chef server and a non-prod Chef server. Changes you made in one repo would get pushed to that server that it was mapped to. An important thing about knife upload slash is that it is crazy dangerous. They changed the meaning of a flag or the default for a flag, and if you run knife upload with the purge option, it either deletes all the policy that's on the Chef server that isn't in your current working directory, or deletes everything in your current working directory that isn't on the Chef server if you did a knife download. At one point, they said something like, well, the Chef server repo path defaults to your home directory, and I don't see any directories in there that are on the Chef server, and just wipe out someone's home directory. That's probably not going to happen again, but don't run this command by hand. This is not for humans to use. Humans are soft, weak, pitiful. Jenkins will make sure that this works the same time every time. You're going to look at the knife upload slash command. You're going to see that it has an option for don't do roles. Burks file. It's not going to manage every single cookbook, certainly not all the dependencies, and I don't use it to pin versions of cookbooks. I just point it at the head, and I say the head of all these cookbooks is deployable, and I'm going to lock down what each node can consume by using cookbook constraints in the environment. But at least now my environments are managed in this Chef repo. Let's see. And like I said, I think you're just going to have a couple of cookbooks in there. You're going to have a role cookbook, you're going to have a base cookbook, you're going to have some sort of application-specific cookbook, 3, 4, 5 lines in this Burk file, not 40 lines. Then you're going to want to ignore all the policy that you don't want to accidentally manage. So the example code I'll throw up here in a bit, or I'm not going to show you the code, I'll just point you to the repo, says, hey, I'm never going to let anybody check anything called clients into Git. I'm never going to let you check a PEM into Git. I'm never going to let you check an ACL into Git because I don't want to accidentally manage that, and I don't want Jenkins to blindly Sorcerer's Apprentice wipe out my world with it. All right, so now we're going to talk about an important factor of any pipeline is that it knows how to treat different branches of your repo differently. So the master branch, the way I like to work, and this may not be your cup of tea, is the master branch is always deployable and reflects reality. Whatever is in the master branch of my Chef repo should be the policy that is on my Chef server. Every repo to a Chef org, I can have a bidirectional check. Master, like I said, is always deployed or deployable. Additionally, you configure Git so that the master branch cannot be merged to by any way other than Jenkins running through some tests, validating everything, and then making your changes making your changes happen. So that's the master branch. But of course, you have feature and pull request branches. You should not or could not have continuous integration and continuous deployment without tests. I mean, you can, but like bad, right? So these pipelines should do really basic things. Ideally, you're going to customize these to your business needs and things that have burned you in the past, but at the very least, you could, for any proposed feature branch, check basic syntax. Ruby-C all the Ruby files, JSON-lint all the JSON files. You could make sure that everything is formatted properly. You can make sure that all of your all of your environments have equality pins in the cookbook constraints. Any arbitrary business logic you have, you can shove into this validation stage to make sure that nothing makes it to master unless it meets your criteria. Additionally, for every PR that you pull, you're going to run knife inspect. Knife inspect is not included in the Chef DK. It is superior to knife diff in that it can deal with Ruby files as well as JSON files, and the output is super nice. So you propose a PR, Jenkins runs the PR, it checks to make sure that all your files are cool, it checks to make sure your business logic is cool, and then it's going to throw this knife inspect up saying, if you merge this to master, I'm going to make this change to this role. I'm going to make this change to this environment. And then it's on you to say, that's what I wanted, let's merge, or some other reviewer to do that. since you feel that master is always deployed or deployable, there's nothing stopping you from having that extra belt and suspender check of a separate external process that looks at the master branch of the repo and runs essentially knife inspect against what's on the chef server. If you see that change, then you know someone has gotten a knife and has uploaded policy to your server, and you need to find and stop them. But that's a worthy thing to alert on in my mind. Okay, so make sure I didn't miss any notes here. We're cool. Beyond EC2 Cloud that comes in ChefDK these days, VMware Cloud, or can't remember any other people's. That's terrible. VMware, that's pretty much my only go-to example. You would include these extra gems that you need as part of your policy. If you had elaborate checks that required external API checks, you would make sure the gem file was there so that your automation process knew I need to load these gems before I can run any of the suites. Similarly, if you have a lot of involved RSpec or other validation tests and you don't want to remember those commands because, again, you're a soft, pitiful human, you would put that logic into a rake file so that all you have to remember is rake validate, rake test. And then, of course, you get to pull that logic out of Groovy, which may not be your primary language, it's not mine, into a rake file so that your Groovy. Speaking of Jenkins file, you're going to have that to drive all the policy. There's no reason you couldn't use Travis or Circle CI. I'm just using Jenkins because that's what people pay me to do, and I don't go the extra mile to learn something that no one's going to pay me to do. It's not true. It's not true. Yeah. You could include the test suite, like I mentioned. You don't have to use chef spec if you're just dealing with objects in the chef repo. If you want to make assertions about the contents of JSON file, RSpec's a perfectly good language for that. Have a test directory in there. Never upload the test directory, but the test directory says, again, the cookbook constraints always have to be equality pins. I don't have any data bags with the word password in them that are not encrypted. Anything you want to enforce and anything that your company cares about or your process cares about, enforce it via tests, run that on every PR branch and have your Jenkins file or rake file drive it. And I mentioned, of course, you could have launched Kitchen, like I said. If, this is where it gets a little iffy, I think ChefFS lets you deal with Ruby or JSON files if it's building a Chef Zero server. I think Test Kitchen, for whatever reason, only wants to deal with JSON files. If you've made the decision that all of your policy is written down as JSON, of course you could just spin up a Test Kitchen instance and have it point the data bag path and the environment and query the Chef server. You may not feel comfortable with that. Up to you.